Hi, I'm Shira. Hey, do you like Deborah's hat? I know, right? In this hat, Deborah looks like the little skeleton friend on my shirt from our last video. Did you? Wow, what a smooth plug slash segue. Okay, so everyone's a critic, huh? Yeah, well, regardless, please do take a little looky-loo at our last video. This is the second video installment in this series. We're looking into how we got to the current day American political parties, resulting in our extreme polarization. We're looking into this, seeing how we got here so we can figure out how to overcome our polarization. So the last video, the first video in this series, just gave a little Spark Notes timeline of the beginning, the forming of the American political parties. In particular, because I just find it so interesting and really very much worth talking about right now. Looking at how way long ago, when the American political parties were just first forming, the Republican Party used to be considered to be liberal. Liberal, you know, to use that word, that's how it was phrased in articles and research. I just hate to say that and use that label or any kind of label when it comes to what should just be always basic humanity. But we were looking back at how the newly formed Republican Party was anti-slavery, how President Abraham Lincoln was the first Republican president, and today Trump, a mega racist, took over the Republican Party and was endorsed by the KKK. Side note, I just have to, how in the actual world does the KKK still exist? Some folks seemed confused and upset in response to our last video, the first installment in the series, which I asked about, but they didn't really explain why. As I said, the information in our last video is factual, except for second half when I made a prediction based on observations and patterns of history. Predictions aren't facts. All the other information was factual, and I think it can really help us see the bigger picture. So much is missed when we're just looking at one spot in time or place. I mean, look how the American political parties started out, how they've shifted majorly and react to each other's extremes. This can help us make meaning of the madness. So as always, sources are listed. One of the biggest things we all need to be wary of in this time, always and onwards, is how ubiquitous propaganda is. Super important, so stay tuned, sweets. Right then, where we left off, the Civil War had ended, leaving the South in ruins and the North wealthy from war. See, slave labor was so ingrained in the South's economy, which has felt so impossible for me to grasp. Why not pay people to harvest crops and treat them humanely? Right. So this subheading and the content in this article stood out to me so much, I just need to highlight it. It's titled, "Economic Necessity Trumps Morality." Wow. Headline relevant then, relevant now. There's of course much more to it than that. That's a headline that hits this impossible situation on the head. The South was completely dependent on slavery, and while President Abraham Lincoln did not abolish slavery, he did pass the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed more than 3 million enslaved people in the Confederate States by January 1st, 1863. In a speech delivered April 11th, while referring to plans for Reconstruction in Louisiana, Lincoln proposed that some Black people, including free Black people and those who had enlisted in the military, deserved the right to vote. He was assassinated 3 days later. Absolutely abysmal voting rights injustice that is still happening today. So Lincoln's assassinated, his vice president, Andrew Johnson, becomes president. Andrew Johnson was against Lincoln's Slavery Emancipation Proclamation. So the work of Reconstruction, which was meant to secure some civil rights and reparations, was stopped. For instance, reparations like formerly enslaved people were supposed to be allocated 40 acres and a mule. To much outrage, formerly enslaved people were promised this, and it turned out that that promise was empty. They never got their 40 acres and a mule. If they had gotten their 40 acres and a mule, this country would be so different. After 1867, an increasing number of Southern white people, mostly Democrats, turned to violence in response to the changes of Reconstruction. The Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist organizations targeted local Republican leaders and other African Americans who challenged white authority. So in that time, Republicans for the most part were standing up for what's right, while Democrats were pushing what's utterly and morally wrong. I mean, that's major. And yes, of course, white people, Republican, Democrat, any and all white people, racism ingrained in them way before the forming of the American political parties. When I say, see, the Republicans were standing up for what's right, it's because the Republican Party, again, the first Republican president being Abraham Lincoln, was working to, at the very least, end slavery, which was so ingrained in South's economy.
There are various extremes of racism, the most vilely extreme being the KKK, and what I'm trying to point out is how the KKK in earlier history attacked members of the Republican Party, while today the KKK is comprised of some members of the Republican Party and supports the Republican Party, which is the opposite of what it was doing in earlier history.
That what I'm saying is, of course, all the white people had all the racism, Republican, Democrat. Political parties were standing for very different things, and they're standing for very different things now. But then we start to see a shift as the decade continued. In 1874, after an economic depression plunged much of the South into poverty, Republicans became more conservative and less egalitarian, and the Democratic Party won control of the House of Representatives for the first time since the Civil War. The Compromise of 1876 marked the end of Reconstruction as a distinct period, but the struggle to deal with the revolution ushered in by slavery's eradication would continue in the South and elsewhere long after that date. A century later, the legacy of Reconstruction would be revived during the civil rights movement of the 1960s, as African Americans fought for the political, economic, and social equality that they had long been denied. So we now enter the despicable Jim Crow era. By 1908, all states of the former Confederacy had passed new constitutions or suffrage amendments. Legislators created a variety of barriers, including longer residency requirements, rule variations, and literacy tests subjectively applied against people of color. So everything was segregated until 1948. President Harry Truman ordered integration in the military, and in 1954, the Supreme Court ruled in Brown versus Board of Education that educational segregation was unconstitutional, bringing an end to the era of separate but equal education. The remaining Jim Crow laws were overruled by the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Okay, dear folks, give yourselves a nice stretch or something for getting through decades worth of extremely painful American history. The end of Jim Crow brings us to the end of this video. It's such a horrendous time in history that always needs to be remembered and talked about as we seek to understand how the we got here. So much more to go and do, so please do let us know if breaking this up into shorter videos is working well for you, or if you'd prefer a longer video to cover more in one. Your feedback is precious and much appreciated. Join us next time. We'll be talking about some really interesting things that are incredibly relevant for what's happening today, which can help us make sense of it all. Put her there, partner. Please comment, like, subscribe, one of the three, or all of the three, if you please. And thank you so much. Much love to you, dear folks. I hope you love you too. Hey, a series of how we got here. Bye-bye. Don't look at me. Don't look at me. Nope.